Hi, I'm Christina Mangurian. I'm the Vice Chair for Diversity and Health Equity, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Camara Jones, our 2021-22 UCSF Presidential Chair. I remember at one of our first meetings, Dr. Jones told me that she'd been on a presidential tour. She started at Harvard in 2019, and then Yale 2020, and then we've been so fortunate to have her here with us this year. As many of you know, Dr. Jones has already been very kind and gave a brief presentation at our diversity celebration in July. And I'm really delighted she's back and that we're able to learn more from her today. For those of you who don't know her, she's a family physician, epidemiologist, and past president of the American Public Health Association. Her work focuses on naming, measuring, and addressing impacts of racism on the health and well-being of our nation and the world. She's taught at Harvard and was a chief medical officer at the CDC, and currently is an adjunct professor at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory and a senior fellow and adjunct associate professor at Morehouse School of Medicine. Dr. Jones's allegories on race and racism illuminate topics that are otherwise difficult for many Americans to understand or discuss. Recognizing that racism saps the strength of the whole society through a waste of human resources, she aims to mobilize and engage all Americans in a sustained national campaign against racism. I am continuously amazed by how many people, including myself, call themselves fangirls or fanboys of Dr. Jones and her work. She has an absolutely remarkable mind, enthusiasm and passion that leaps off the Zoom screen, and an incredible capacity to pass batons. I'm sure you'll understand that inside joke later on in this talk, and look forward to each of you getting a baton or two of your own from Dr. Jones today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And then before we start, there's going to be a Q&A session at 9:20. So if you have questions for Dr. Jones, please submit them in the public chat box. Or if you'd like to ask a question live, click on the reactions button and raise your hand. If your name is called, the host will unmute your microphone. And if you wouldn't mind, please change your name on Zoom to make sure it's identifiable now. All right, thank you very much, and handing over to you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mangurian. And I'm delighted to be back with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And I've entitled my offering this morning, Confronting Racism Denial, Naming Racism and Moving to Action. So just a second about why I did that. Oh, first I should acknowledge that I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. But just a note about why I'm saying confronting racism denial. I have recently come to understand that racism denial is a huge black hole in our national landscape. Like black holes in the universe, it's massive and it's powerful, and you can't see it. It's difficult to see because like black holes in the universe, even when light gets near it gets sucked in. And so I think that part of our anti-racism work that I'm going to be inviting you into this morning is going to be addressing opportunity structures, addressing kind of value hierarchies and that kind of thing, but also specifically addressing racism denial because it's so staunchly held in our nation and it's so seductive and it undermines all of our work. So 6 years ago, in 2016, I was the president of the American Public Health Association. And in that role, I used it up, right? And I launched our association and our state affiliates and as many other organizations and communities as would join us in a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks. The first being to name racism, because you have to name a problem before you can even get started addressing it. But as necessary as naming racism is, it is insufficient. We need to move to action. So the second of the 3 tasks of this national campaign against racism is to actually ask the question, how is racism operating here in all of our context, to help us identify levers for intervention, targets for action. And then once we've done that landscaping, the third of the 3 tasks is to organize and strategize to act, because collective action is power. So when we do that first task, naming of racism, which is actually the first part of confronting racism denial, there are actually 4 key messages when endeavoring to name racism in this country. The first is the fact that racism exists. The second key message is that racism is a system. The third key message is that racism saps the strength of the whole society. And the fourth key message is that, yes, we can act to dismantle racism. So during the bit of time we have this morning, I'm going to actually share with you some allegories to illustrate all of these key messages. The first allegory that I'm going to share with you that I call dual reality, a restaurant saga, is to help people understand that racism exists. People whose whole life has been, in this vortex of racism denial, people whose whole life has been to proclaim that this is the land of equal opportunity. So this allegory, like many of my allegories, is actually sparked by something that happened to me in my real life. So let me take you back to when I was a first-year medical student. And on this given Saturday, like on most Saturdays, because I was very diligent, right, very studious, I had awakened early and hit the books, nose in, studying hard. And it was already mid-afternoon when some friends of mine came over. And did my friends distract me from my studies? Oh, no. We all got to studying long and hard. So now here we are, all deep in the books, and it's getting late, and we're getting hungry. And I have no food in the apartment, which was so typical of me that my friends actually understood. And they were like, okay, never mind, Camara, we got that, but we're hungry. So let's go into town and find something to eat. So we do. We walk into town and we find a restaurant and we walk in and we sit down and the menus are presented and we order our food. And the food is served, and here we are eating. So maybe not the story about racism at a restaurant that people in my generation might have anticipated, but there is a story about racism in this restaurant right here. Hold on, let me rejoin the story. Here we are, sitting, eating, and I look across the room, and I notice a sign that's a startling revelation to me about racism. So now I've intrigued you, perhaps. And now you're wondering, but okay, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Well, what did the sign say? The sign said, open. So now maybe I've lost most of you, because how is a sign saying open a startling revelation about racism? Well, let me recap. Here we are, sitting in a restaurant eating. I look up, I see a sign that says open, thinking no more about it. I would assume that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I actually recognized that now the restaurant was indeed closed due to the hour, but firmly closed, and that other hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that's when I recognized that racism structures open, closed signs in our society, that racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. In fact, it's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, although we are living it so large right now with how much of the global supply of COVID-19 vaccine we have sequestered in this country. Now, those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it proclaims close to them that they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that is part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, why? Why, you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door and let them come in? You'll make more money. And oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass some food through the window. Or maybe you try to tear down the sign or break through the door. But at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign that proclaims open to you. So this is the story I tell when I have 5 or 6 minutes to convey, to equip, first of all, to convey to some and equip others with a very short image and a short story that racism is structuring two-sided or multi-sided signs in our society. It is creating dual or multifaceted realities, right? And actually, I have sparked on at least 2 occasions a 3-hour conversation each time with the following question, which is, how could people who were born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? And actually, each time it was a 3-hour conversation because there are many ways to know. I am heartened that more people who were born inside the restaurant and maybe just 2 years ago would have been saying, they would have been sitting at the table of opportunity, eating and saying, what are those people outside saying? Black lives matter. Don't they know all lives matter? More of those people are now actually proclaiming, yes, Black lives matter. More people born inside the restaurant are actually saying the word racism and putting together the phrases systemic racism or structural racism. This is heartening because we must name a problem in order to get started on the solution. But here is my warning. If all we do is say a thing, name racism, put a statement on our institutional website, proclaim something through Instagram or Facebook or tweet something out. If we just say a thing, because racism denial is so staunchly held by so many in this nation and is so seductive, 6 months from now, we may forget why we said that thing because we have been fallen into what I describe as the sleepiness, the somnolence of racism denial. So we must go beyond saying a thing, beyond naming racism to action. We need to tear down the sign. And actually, racism is more than just a sign. It's the sign, it's the door, it's the lock. There's a whole system going on. We need to dismantle the lock, take the door off the hinges, because once we start acting, we will not forget why we are acting. So that's my first allegory, and it's my invitation to all of us to understand that, yes, racism exists, and an invitation to go beyond naming racism, which after all is necessary, but insufficient. We need to name racism, yes, and then we need to move to action. So now I know I owe you a definition of racism. When I say the word racism, I'm clear that I'm talking about a system. So I'm not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing, or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested, even though, yes, it can manifest in those ways. And I'd be interested in how important you guys think having racism as, in the, the diagnostic DSM-3 or whatever number we're on now, it used to be a long time ago, it was 3. How important you think that is. And yes, it can manifest in all of these ways, but in its essence, racism is a system of power. And a system of doing what? A system of doing 2 things, of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on so-called race, which is the social interpretation of how one looks in our race-conscious society, which is what we call race. And there I'm making a distinction that what we think of as race, which you will see, I wag my fingers, I use air quotes all the time, every time I say that word. What we think of as race is actually this, what we call socially assigned race. It's the on the street attribution without asking a person, excuse me, how do you self-identify? Or excuse me, where were you born? Where were your parents born? Or even, excuse me, may I have a little aliquot of your blood? I have a genetic hypothesis I want to test. It's this on the street race, the substrate on which racism has operated for centuries and continues to operate today, that in our health system turns into health statistics when a medical admitting clerk might check off a race for somebody, or it's that same race that becomes part of a health statistic is the same race that a taxi driver notices, or a police officer, or a teacher in a classroom, or a judge in a courtroom. And it is that race that has profound impacts on the health and well-being of each of us. Now, so if race is the social interpretation of how one looks, and clearly it is not in our genes. We've mapped the human genome. There is no basis in the human genome for racial subspeciation. If race is the social interpretation of how one looks in our race-conscious society, racism is the system that operates on that so-called race to structure opportunity and assign value, and it has many impacts. The first impact, when people do acknowledge, yeah, racism does exist, they usually recognize that racism is unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take any of us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country, because it makes some people, especially some people who are living as white, uncomfortable. I used to almost apologize for that discomfort, especially when I was in person doing talks, and I would get to about this point in my definition and I would see people start to fidget. And I would say, well, I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable. Shake it off, stay with me, I'll tell you more stories. I don't apologize anymore. What I say is, if you feel uncomfortable acknowledging that racism is unfairly advantaging those who are structurally advantaged by their whiteness in our setting, I encourage you to lean into that discomfort, because I have come to recognize that for all of us, the edge of our comfort is actually our growing edge. But there's a third impact of racism that many of us miss, and that is that racism does indeed sap the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources, as well as through how it sets people one against the other, and how it separates some people from their own interest. But the biggest impact is that racism saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. We see that when we don't vigorously invest as a nation in the full, excellent public education of all of our kids, because the blinders of racism have made some decision makers feel like there's no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. When in fact, we know that there's genius in all of our communities. And if we were to only vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation, or even as a world. Racism is sapping the strength of the whole society when those same blinders that don't value all of us equally make us complacent with what I describe as a wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many Black and brown men and women in our prison system, as if that didn't separate us from human potential. So many examples of this. I won't stay here long, but I will say that I think that this impact of racism, how it saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources, is the impact we need to lift up most urgently these days. So we need more conversations about that impact in our faculty meetings. We need more conversations about that impact in our board meetings. We need more conversation around our dinner tables, right? So that more people feel a sense of urgency to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. One more thing I want to say about this, and just very quickly, I'm at risk of using up all my time in some of the early slides, but this notion of the unfair disadvantage and reciprocal unfair advantage. I was actually, when I was at CDC, told toward the end of my time at CDC, which was why it was the end of my time at CDC, told by somebody who cleared my slides that I needed to take that second point about unfairly advantages other individuals and communities off the slide because it makes white people uncomfortable. He said those things. And so I pushed back, right? But he could clear my presentations or not. And they started withdrawing talks I was invited to and all of that. And then for a minute, they said, we got to the compromise. If I took the words unfairly off, then I could talk about disadvantage and advantage as long as I didn't characterize either as unfair, right? Well, that whole thing, which prompted me to escape from CDC and move to the Morehouse School of Medicine. Thank you for Dr. David Satcher. Thank you for HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Thank you for havens where you don't have to have this struggle daily. I mean, it really did impact my health, I believe. But that taught me it wasn't just this one individual. There are many people in this country who do acknowledge that they're two states of being, but they would describe them as disadvantaged and normal. And the reason that many people think they're two states of being, which are disadvantaged and normal, is that we as a nation are ahistorical. And we act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance, and people do not recognize that their so-called normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. But anyway, I have stayed on this slide a long time, so let me move. And so then how could this system turn into health outcomes and differences in health outcomes by so-called racial groups? So I've described 3 levels of racism to help me understand this. Institutionalized, or what we would these days now call structural, personally mediated, which many people would call interpersonal, but because I know that racism is a system, I call it personally mediated racism, this level, because it's the system mediated through people, and internalized. So let me define each of these levels, give you examples of how they can impact health and turn into health outcomes, and then illustrate these 3 levels, their relationships, and what we can do with my Gardener's Tale allegory. And I am aware that many of you may have heard me like over years, or may have heard me, speak in various settings at UCSF since July. And what I want to say is, if you have heard some of these stories before, I want you to listen with different ears this time to the nuances of the storytelling so that you can tell the stories back. And also, every time I tell a story, I say it somehow differently. And so I want you to engage, even if you're like, oh, I thought I heard this before. Okay, so this first level of racism, institutionalized or structural racism, is basically the system. It's the constellation of structures and policies and practices and norms and values, which all roll together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that actually doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator because it's been institutionalized in our laws and customs and background norms. This level of racism shows up as inherited disadvantage, or its reciprocal inherited advantage. And it shows up in terms of access, material conditions, as well as access to power. So examples include differential access to quality housing, excellent educational opportunities, equal employment opportunities, same level of income at the same level of employment. And these things, all of these by race, and so these things clearly impact health. Differential access to medical facilities, including physical access, including financial access, including linguistic access. Differential access to a clean environment, and the very well documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus transfer stations in communities of color. The whole notion of, sacrifice zones, communities that are near known polluting industries, which are disproportionately communities of color. Why would the EPA even have a term called sacrifice zones? Just move the people out or shut down the industry. Anyway, so the environmental racism. And then, so all of that is about in terms of material conditions. In terms of access to power as information, which could be health information, or even information about our own histories. Differential access to power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources. Knowing somebody in the board, having your physician have admitting privileges to a given institution. And access to power as voice in government, which, across this nation, a lot of gerrymandering and all to limit different groups' voice in government, voice in media, and the like. Now, on previous occasions, people have stopped me about here and said, Dr. Jones, please take a careful look at your top set of examples: housing, education, employment, income. Isn't that what we call social class? So why do you have this on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism, or are you really, really, really talking about social class? And that is such an important question that I now carry it with me everywhere. And I'm going to answer the question because many of you might be having the same question in your heart. The first part of my answer is the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for example, for American Indians, for indigenous North Americans, the initial historical injustice was the taking of the land, and then the near genocide, and then moving survivors to reserved lands. And then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick the people up and move them someplace else. There are families that for centuries lived in Mexico, never crossed the border, but the border crossed them. They find themselves in New Mexico, and of course, Texas, Arizona, California. And their great-great-great-grandchildren are still being vilified, dehumanized, targeted with the El Paso massacre and the like. There are Chinese people who were brought to this country to help build our transcontinental railway. And then in the 1880s with the Chinese Exclusion Act, unable by law to bring their families, unable by law to marry. There are Japanese Americans during World War II who were interned in prison camps, while German Americans and Italian Americans were not treated in the same way. For people of African descent, the initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people, our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage, and then for the survivors and their progeny for generations and generations and generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But now, some people have heard me and they say, oh, Dr. Jones, you are going there? I said, Dr. Jones, we all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, don't we all know that the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865? And we're now in 2022, which makes that 157 years ago. So Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? Well, the answer to the question is actually embedded in the question, isn't it? All else being equal. All else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are what I describe as present day, contemporary structural factors which are perpetuating that and all of these other initial historical injustices that I just laid out for you. And these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of structural racism. So when you ask me, am I talking about racism or am I actually really talking about social class? My response is that structural racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. And this is, it's not just a happenstance. And this understanding is an important aha, right? Now, I also want to say that some people say, oh, Dr. Jones, you're so focused on racism. You don't care about poor white people, do you? And that is not the case. I care deeply about poor white people, poor Black people, poor Indigenous people, poor Latinx people, poor Asian people, poor Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander people, poor every kind of people. This is not attention to and work on anti-racism and dismantling racism. It's not an either or anti-poverty or anti-racism struggle here. In fact, I highly endorse the Build Back Better plan, highly endorse the child tax credits, which eliminate child poverty, half of child poverty. We needed to go the whole thing. If we had a magic wand, which the Build Back Better plan was in many regards getting us there, to eliminate poverty, I'm all in. In fact, if we had a magic wand, ding, ding, that with two things could equalize income across the board, I would go there today. But here's my warning. If we did that without addressing the background structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, the mechanisms of structural or institutionalized racism, then even if we equalize income across the board, all races today, within one generation, we would start to see a stratification by race again in terms of income and wealth, because we have to address those background things that we don't even see, which means that this is not an anti-poverty or an anti-racism struggle or dialectic, it is a both and. The other thing I want to say, recognizing I've spent a lot of time on this slide, is that structural racism can show up through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as through acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very often structural racism shows up as inaction, lack of action in the face of need. So the second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. This is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination. And it shows up, I'm not going to stay as long on this slide, but police brutality, which not only, often maims or takes lives and injures families, but it also causes communities to be bracing ourselves for the next occurrence, because for the most part, police officers still are not being held fully accountable for their actions in these killings or maimings. Physician disrespect, which can be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures that patient couldn't understand, couldn't afford, wouldn't comply, or whatever they assume, as well as being quite blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our, throughout history. And I want to say, especially in psychiatric and behavioral sciences stuff, I am aware that this kind of not giving the full range of treatment options may also still be working in your domain, okay? So I want you to think about that. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment. These are just two manifestations of what some people call everyday racism. The so-called microaggressions, which don't feel so micro if you're on the being aggressed side of it, but the subtle communication of disrespect, which may be related to elevated blood pressures in communities of color, blood pressures that don't even go down at night. And teacher devaluation, very important. If a teacher looks at a young child and thinks, that child can't learn, and puts that child off in the attention deficit disorder track. I know ADD exists, right? But if it's like a catch-all track, then that child will never even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. So like institutionalized or structural racism, personally mediated racism can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing. But even more important is to recognize that this level of racism can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, for many, many years, I only put on my slide how it impacts health from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, where I define this level of racism as acceptance of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. And I would acknowledge, as people would ask me, well, Dr. Jones, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people walk around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? And I would say, yes, but I never had it on my slide because I couldn't figure out how an internalized sense of entitlement would turn into bad health outcomes. But I have it on my slide now that for members of structurally advantaged races, internalized racism does show up as a sense of entitlement. But the real reason I put it on my slide now is because I had like an aha that this is the bedrock of racism denial. Because if you feel entitled to everything that you have, if your thing is not advantage but is normal, then you have to deny that there's an unfair system going on. This internalized sense of entitlement, that the structural advantage that people are experiencing every day. There are poor white people, but even poor white people are structurally advantaged compared to poor Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, because of their whiteness. If that structural advantage is just normal to you, if you are entitled to that, you must deny that there's that there is some underlying bad system, unjust system going on. And so when I have started thinking about confronting racism denial, it means I have to acknowledge this piece in my internalized racism slide. I must also say that I still don't know how a sense of entitlement can turn into bad health outcomes unless there is a sense of entitlement toward it. And those who have a sense of entitlement toward it, and we're hearing a lot of them today, right? There were a bunch of them in front of Mass General Brigham, last week and again this week. Okay, so that maybe that is related to what some people are describing as the diseases of despair in affecting white populations. So, the suicides, the opioid epidemic and all. But now the rest of my slide is going to be back from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, where internalized racism shows up as self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as. Maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or apply to that college or try to live in that neighborhood or get that job. It turns into the white man's ice is colder syndrome. And that phraseology came to me from my parents' generation. And what it meant for people of color then, and still means for many of us today, is say that I'm Black and I need a lawyer. I might actually seek out a white lawyer over a Black lawyer. Or if I'm sick, I might prefer the white doctor over the Black doctor if I could find a Black doctor. Or if my lemonade were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the Black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. It turns out it shows up as resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, which turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors. And it is really about accepting limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. I could, of course, go deeper on that, but I'm aware of my time. And so I am going to now shift to my Gardner's Tale allegory, which will help us understand these different levels of racism and give us a little bit of insight into what we need to do to set things right. So I'm going to temporarily stop sharing. I know you've seen my hands flying all over the place, but right now you're going to really see my hands as part of the storytelling. So I am going to first, this story, like I said, many of my allegories was sparked by something I saw with my own real eyes. So let me tell you what I saw with my own real eyes, and then I'm going to make it a story about racism. My husband and I had been married about a year when we moved down to Baltimore for me to finish my PhD at Hopkins. And we bought our first freestanding house, cute little house, big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. Now, we bought this house in October, which was really not the time to plant in Baltimore, so we didn't. We waited until spring, but when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, he actually ran out with our marigold seeds, going to decorate our cute little house. But then he came back in and he said, Camara, some of these boxes have dirt in them, but some of the boxes are empty. So, I need to go down to the gardening store. So he does. He walks down to the garden, drives down, goes down to the gardening store, and he comes back hauling big old bags of potting soil. Right? And so then we fill up those empty boxes. Then we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds and put them in all of the boxes, and we water all of the boxes equally. And then by this time, because I am not the gardener in the family, by this time I am exhausted, right? So I figure I'm just going to sit back and be delighted, right? Well, 3 weeks later, as I'm walking out of my front door onto our porch, I finally pay attention to these flower boxes, and what I saw made me literally stop in my tracks, because what I saw made me think we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants and the plants were tall and vigorous looking. And some of the boxes just had a few plants in them and they were kind of scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had bought turned out to be rich, fertile soil. So that every single seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil just died. But even the strong seed in the poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it halfway up. And some of you guys might be nodding now because maybe you're gardeners, maybe you've composted half of your garden, maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes. And the image, of course, is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to take this image and make it a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms, and the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, puts it in the rich, fertile soil, pink seed over in the poor, rocky soil. 3 weeks later in her garden, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all the red seed sprouts, strong red seed, tall and vigorous. Even the weak red seed makes it halfway up. In the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed dies, becomes a strong pink seed, struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those two flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt this story there to say the first part of this story is how structural or institutionalized racism works, where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through lack of action, inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick the story back up to say, well, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, the gardener's looking at the red flowers thinking, oh, those red flowers are so beautiful. And then she looks at the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil. So she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not acknowledging or perhaps not even recognizing that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, bzzz, into one of the pink flowers, and then bzzz, into another pink flower, and bzzz, to this pink flower, and this flower's like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing, the internalized racism. We can go over to the pink flowers and say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, oh, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener, or grand rounds or something. So it's all good. So here we are, have a conversation with the gardener. And in our, workshop, we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. So what do we really need to do to set things right in this garden? We must address the structural racism, which means that if we either have to break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if it's important to you to keep separate boxes, I guess that's all right too, although it does make it easier for that same gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if we keep separate boxes and we want to make things right in the garden, we need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious, so that in that intervention on structural racism, we will have also addressed the internalized racism. Pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better. And in that intervention, we may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave, preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful will be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story I have told you is to help us understand that, the relationship between these three levels of racism, and that we must at least address structural racism if we're going to set things right in the garden. Good to address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the structural racism, and the other levels may take care of themselves. But there's one more question before I leave this story, which is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which are actually the elements of self-determination. So who is the gardener in the US context? Well, government is a huge part of the gardener, but not the only part. Media, foundations, corporations, health systems, communities to the extent they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. So then the question arises, what do we do about the gardener? Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers need to grow or recruit their own gardener? Many questions can come out of this. And even recognizing my time and that I have only 5 minutes left, I want to share with you 2 questions that I carry with me everywhere. And then I'm going to race through the rest of it so we can have some conversation. The first question I was asked this maybe even 2 decades ago. Dr. Jones, excuse me, but why should the red flowers share their soil? When I heard that question, why should the red flowers share their soil? I loved that question because it showed me the power of this story to start conversations about racism, which might be otherwise difficult when we're talking about, racism between you and me. My answer to the question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers. It belongs to the whole garden. Here's a second question. What if that's not the original gardener we're looking at right there? What if that's the gardener's great, 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 great grandchild? Here we are. And the great, 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 great grandchild has always seen the flowers looking like that, may not even think there's a problem to be solved. So in 3 quick steps, the first thing is we must make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution. We have to put it on our active, our urgent kind of action agenda. Then once it's on the agenda, what are we to do? Well, in order to get started, we need to make those flower boxes transparent. We need to be able to see and talk about the differences in the quality of the soil so that we can address those differences, right? And then step 3, as we make those flower boxes transparent, we need to make sure that everybody understands that the pink seed did not just go launch themselves into that poor rocky soil. So we must talk about history, and we must talk about how the gardener's initial preference for red over pink set up the whole situation. So we must talk about, history, yes, and that what some people call cultural racism, what in our society is clearly white supremacist ideology. We must call it out and address it explicitly, because if we do not, even if we were able to compel that red gardener today to enrich the poor rocky soil today until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil today, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So I used to just, this story, when I defined racism to be a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value, this story used to be all about opportunity structures. I didn't pick up on that nuance until maybe for the last 2 years of telling it. We must address both. I know that I have time just to share with you this allegory and then race through the things we could have talked about, because I do want your questions. This is the third allegory. The other 2 you may have seen before. This one is harder for you to have seen. I haven't really put it out there big yet. This one helps us understand that racism is a system. When I, in this story, talk about cement dust, I want you to think cement dust, right? And I also want you to think racism. So imagine that there is a cement factory spewing cement dust, and the cement dust fills the air. And if any of us are anywhere near this factory for any amount of time, we are going to develop cement dust in our lungs. And the cement dust in our lungs is problematic for all of us, even for those who don't recognize that they have cement dust in our lungs. And even for the factory owner who might, trade off a little cement dust in their lungs for whatever profit they're getting from the factory. Now, the cement dust in our lungs might affect different ones of us differently. So maybe the cement dust in my lungs makes me feel like I'm less than, whereas the cement dust in somebody else's lungs makes him feel that he can, with equanimity, crush the life out of another human being with his knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. But however it affects us, it is problematic for all of us. So then how do we address this problem? Do we focus on the individual? Well, that's a strategy. Seems the most straightforward, right? It seems maybe the easiest. I'm going to share with you two ideas with 2 strategies in that rubric. The first of one I really don't recommend as a fixer, but what if we had a kind of screening machine and we assessed each person for how much cement dust they have in their lungs, and then if you have too much dust in your lungs, an alarm goes off. Well, that might be a useful machine for people who don't recognize that they have any dust in their lungs, to just let them know, right? But what are we going to do with the people who have too much dust in their lungs? Are we going to put them to the edge of society? Are we going to vote them off the island? I mean, what are we going to do? And actually, the biggest problem with this is that if we had this kind of machine, it makes people not even want to let the machine get near them. It makes them not even want to talk about cement dust at all. So here I'm going to switch to the language about racism just for this one point. The reason that many people don't even want to say the word racism is they think that when you say the word racism, you are actually trying to divide the room into who's racist and who's not, or peer deeply into their souls to ask exactly how racist are you. So I think that as useful as this might be, it might backfire, right? But what if you had people who recognize they have cement dust in their lungs, and we could set up a cleansing spot because they want it out, right? So we set up this cleansing spot, and people could either volunteer to go in or be voluntold, be suggested to go in. And so they go in and they read history, and they go across town, stay a while, and they come out as good as new. But if they come back out into that same cloud of dust, the cement dust will reaccumulate in their lungs. So this is not a very permanent solution unless the person stays living in this cleansing spa. So what does it mean then? They were good as new and they came out into this cloud of dust. Do we need to acknowledge the cloud? Well, what would that look like? Well, if we acknowledge the cloud, at least I would know that I wasn't born with cement dust in my lungs, right? That is because I'm living in this cloud of cement dust. And if that understanding helps me to, like, I got to do something, maybe I'll put on a gas mask, right? Maybe I'll start my individual anti-racism journey, recognizing that once I start, if I don't want more cement dust in my lungs, I need to wear the gas mask 24/7. And it actually encourages me when I see myself reflected in a mirror or a glass, to see that I still have my gas mask on. I am hoping that it's filtering out a lot of the dust in the air, recognizing it doesn't extract the cement dust that was already in my lungs, right? But also when you see me wearing my gas mask, you're gonna ask, Dr. Jones, why are you wearing a gas mask? And I'll say, oh, we're living in this big cloud of cement dust, right? And so more and more of you may start your own individual anti-racist, anti-cement dust journeys. You might don your gas mask, right? And this is encouraging. Maybe this is the answer. All we have to do is create 330 million gas masks, little baby gas masks, old people gas masks. Is this the answer? Well, it's a start, but I think it's insufficient. What we really need to do is dismantle the factory. So especially those of us who already have started our individual anti-racism journeys, we have our gas masks on, we need to move to action, and we can see a little bit more clearly, and we understand there is a factory in the middle of all this cloud of dust. Other people may not even know that, because all they see is the dust. The dust is obscuring the factory. But then we need to get closer and we need to ask, how is this factory operating here? And then we need to organize and strategize to act, to dismantle this factory and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. So this allegory has been to not only say that racism is a system, but that if we want to address racism, we must address it at the system's level if we're going to have any impact. Okay, so I'm 2 minutes into our Q&A time, so I'm just going to say the question, how is racism operating here, is a legitimate question. Racism is not a cloud or a miasma we can't get a handle on. It is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, which sounds like a headache to figure out until you recognize these are the elements of decision-making. Structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table, who's not, what's on the agenda, what's not. Policies, the written how of decision-making. Practices and norms, the unwritten how of decision-making. Practice is what we do today, norms, how we've always done it and how we expect you to do it, and values, the why. And we should take this question with us everywhere. I also had a 3-part definition of health equity. The most important thing is that achieving health equity requires at least these 3 things: valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources according to need. Because when you value all of us equally, then you must recognize and rectify historical injustices and provide resources according to need. I had 7 barriers in our culture that we wanted to talk about: our narrow focus on the individual, our ahistorical stance, the myth of meritocracy, the myth of a zero-sum game, limited future orientation, myth of American exceptionalism, and white supremacist ideology. I'll just say on this one, not as a lightning rod term, this is just the description of the false idea of a hierarchy of human valuation by race. There is no such hierarchy, with a falser notion that if there were such a hierarchy, that would put white people at the top as the ideal or the norm. But there are many people in this country with this ideology who are walking around with a sense of entitlement. This white supremacist ideology results in the devaluation and, in fact, dehumanization of people of color, and fear of the browning of America that underlies a lot of our political divide today. So going back to the image from Dual Reality, what can we do today? We need to actively look for evidence of two-sided science. Is there something differential going on here by race, by language, by immigration status, by zip code, by religion, by urban, rural, looking not only at outcomes, but also at opportunity structures. We need to burst through our bubbles of experience to experience our common humanity on the other side of town in different circumstances, so we can start building common cause. We need to be interested in the stories of others, believe in the stories of others, and then join in the stories of others. We need to develop a sensitivity to the absence of who's not at the table, what's not on the agenda, what policies are not in place that, if put in place, could be quite productive. We need to reveal inaction in the face of me, because that's how structural racism very often shows up these days. But all the power is not only among those on inside the restaurant. Those of us on the outside need to know our power, recognize that action is power, and especially that collective action is power, because collective action will inform us, inspire us, propel us, and protect us. So thank you. I'm sorry that I talked too deeply into my slides, but hopefully there's still a little bit of time for Q&A.
Yes, we've
Thank you very
got a
much.
little bit of time. Please raise your hand if you have any questions. I will start. I think one of the thank you so much for that. One of the questions that I have for you, since you've been here now for 6 months, is kind of from your perspective, what are the biggest growth areas for UCSF in terms of addressing structural racism? And I know you've been thinking about this a lot, and so I'm curious if you could address that and thoughts about how we could best move forward as an institution.
So it's going to be a little fuzzy right now, but then it's going to. So what I think is that, like all institutions in the U.S., that there's a tension between those who value comfort and those who value social justice. And given the current status quo, that's like a polar tension. And I think that there are a lot of people at UCSF who value comfort. There are a lot of maybe white men who are like, oh, is there a place for white men anymore at UCSF, right? Like, that kind of question might arise as things change. Those who value those who value comfort are comfortable in the status quo. They're like the people sitting inside the restaurant. They don't even wonder maybe why aren't other people coming in. They're not interested. What are those people outside saying? Sometimes in our nation, they're even a little afraid. They heard there might be a two-sided sign going on, but they don't even want to go close and take a peek at the sign. So that's the whole anti-CRT stuff going on. Those who value social justice do so for two reasons. They recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on, and they recognize that it saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. The challenge for UCSF is, as an institution, to have everybody value social justice, even though it might be uncomfortable. We have to recognize, all of us, that the edge of our comfort is our growing edge. And because there is a two-sided sign, yes, and it does sap the strength of the whole society, we need to be all in. The other thing is that when I have gone through the 7 values targets, many people say, aha, what'd you say, myth of meritocracy? Oh, that's really big here at UCSF. And I have seen it even in terms of how people have to apply to be on committees. Like, why wouldn't you take all people who want to be on the committee on the status of women, or all the people who want to be on the LGBTQ committee? Why wouldn't you have all comers? Why is there an application even to be on a committee to do work? There's so much application stuff, and even the notion of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, it sort of reflects a notion that there's equal opportunity for all these flowers to bloom. So it's that we have to, at UCSF, look at how is the myth of meritocracy operating in our system, and what do we need to do?
Excellent. Thank you. Any other questions here? I see some people are saying amazing storytelling.
So Bruce Scotton has his
oh, great.
hand up, not his virtual hand, but his real hand.
Okay, great. Gina, can you unmute him, please?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I really appreciated all that you've shared with us. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I wanted to tell a brief story about an experience that I had in our department. When I was a resident, there was a Black custodian named Jean, who I started just by saying, hi, how are you doing in the hall? And we got to know each other over time, talking at length as we got to be friends. One time, I was now on the faculty, this is now 20 years into the future from our initial meeting. He looked at me and said, Bruce, I never told you this before, but I thought you should know. You are the only doctor here at Langley Porter who has ever spoken to me.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. Oof. It turns out he was also a minister. He was out serving the community. He was an amazing person who had all kinds of insights, not only about our department, but about life in general. Nobody else bothered to find out.
Right.
The moral of the story, I think, is let's talk to each other.
Yes. Thank you. May I say that I so endorse that. In fact, so talk to strangers is part of, so I have 4 BCs, habits of mind, as we go forward. The first is, well, the 4 BCs are be courageous, be curious, be collective, and build community. So be courageous, speak your truth, embrace challenge, know that the edge of our comfort is our growing edge, type of thing. Be curious, ask why and why and why again. And be interested, beliefs, join in the stories of others. Be collective, care about the whole, and build community. Talk to strangers, right? Go across town and stay a while. Live in somebody else's shoes. And so this whole notion of really being interested in others starts with seeing others. and seeing their full humanity and imagining that they could be just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as you are, but living in very different circumstances.
Right.
So often we're in our bubbles and we don't recognize that about others. Thank you so much.
I have one last question. I think that's so true, but this is from Liliana Campos. How do we decentralize the white experience when engaging in DEI efforts systemically and interpersonally? Is that possible?
It's possible if people are conscious about it. So the norm would be to center the white experience. Even the first year medical student course, so there was a whole thing, you know, with the health and the individual, where the course was aimed at kind of white people with little experience, kind of naive white people. Well, with half of the incoming first year medical student class, students of color, they were upset at a lot of different things apparently, but one of them was, why was the course aimed so low? And why were they being involved in teaching their classmates about, you know, anti-racism or their life experience or whatever it was? And so it is so normative to centralize the white that you have to be explicit in understanding that this is not what we're going to do, but you have to recognize it's the whole Black wholeness of white centering whiteness. So that norm is part of the Black hole. So the Black hole of racism denial, I'm going to add now as a result of that question, includes centering whiteness. Thank you for the question. Thank you for expanding. I always learn from the Q&A.
Excellent. And I know we're unfortunately out of time. I do want everybody to know that there are, this Grand Rounds has been recorded, and so it will be available online on the Department of Psychiatry Grand Rounds series. There are a ton of just comments here about how much people have enjoyed your talk, Dr. Jones, and I'm just so grateful that you're here today.
Thank you. And I'm sorry that I should have cut short the Q&A because that is my favorite part, but sometimes I get going. So anyway, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.